going to attend, but let me just move all my buttons into the right spot.
Go for it. We're a minute early anyway, so.
Well, I try to start a little early because I know the technology can be a problem.
Yep. Uh-huh. I understand that. Well, go for it.
Go. There. There. So now I can see chat as needed.
Mhm.
And we're ready to go on YouTube. We'll give that a little bit of time to load up for anyone that logs in that way. Reminder to everyone that it is fine to put questions into chat, either in Zoom or YouTube. And if you're on Zoom, I welcome questions with a live voice. That is also most appreciated. And we are definitely going to get into well, topics that I'm hoping will provoke questions or comments. Whether or not it does, well, I know some people are still a little shy in participating like that, and that's fine. But you can always talk to me about it later. Nothing better than to have someone come up to me at Kiddush lunch and say, you know, Rabbi, I was reviewing what you said about suffering on this week, and then fill in the blank. It's wonderful when people are continuing to think about these things, because that is kind of the whole point. Now, we had a week off, and I know that some of you are watching this recorded, which means you didn't really notice much of a gap there. But for those of you that are doing this while it's happening, we had a week off. So I want to give a quick reminder of the story so far in order to make sure that what we're about to look at in the Talmud here in Brachot is properly contextualized. So we began by talking about the fact that suffering is real. There are some theological traditions outside our own that teach that suffering is an illusion, or suffering is self-induced, or suffering is just the wrong perspective on things. And we'll come back to some of those strategies. But I had to make sure we started off with the basic understanding that suffering is real. Bad things do happen. It's not just us that thinks them bad, that there are things that are objectively bad, and that Judaism is unhappy with that we would like suffering to go away. We have also, through our study of the book of Job, seen that suffering cannot always be tied to misdeeds. The book went out of its way to ensure that we, the reader, knew that there was no classically legitimate reason for Job to be suffering. He was not a bad person. He had done nothing wrong. God still favored him, and yet the suffering happened, so that we would know that we should not be always attributing suffering to misdeeds, nor would we think as an outsider that we can explain another person's suffering by some sort of moral calculation of what they did to deserve it. So that was a very important segment. Now, we began this section of the Talmud in Brachot by looking through a more self-reflective analysis of suffering. That is to say, when a person is experiencing something bad, they can look inward, not up to your neighbor, inward, and ask yourself some questions. Have I done something wrong that might have contributed to this? That is a fine question to ask yourself under some circumstances, as we'll see as we continue. And sometimes there might be a recognition of the self-created problem. If you can't find any reason that it's attributed to, then you maybe have been derelict in your Torah study. If that doesn't seem likely, and remember, being derelict in your Torah study does not mean taking, hours out of your day to earn a living. That is considered essential, not dereliction. But if you do feel like, you know what, I have just been completely derelict, then perhaps this is meant to be a wake-up call. Again, this is an internal monologue. This is not something that you are telling your friend. If, on the other hand, you feel that you've been pretty much up to scratch with your Torah study and your general behavior does not warrant the type of suffering that you're currently experiencing, then you might be able to interpret this as being Isurim Ahava, sufferings of love, meaning that God has loved you enough to bring this suffering upon you. Now that took a lot of explaining, but the idea there, in a very brief nutshell, and go back to the last video for the full nut pie, is the idea that if there is some suffering that is completely undeserved, then if we are enduring it with love from our side as well as God's, then that is going to create a surplus of reward for us in the world to come. Sort of a really, really stringent retirement savings plan. The idea being that I'm going to live at absolute poverty so that when I retire, I will be able to live off of the nest egg that I built up, which is more profitable the earlier you start it, and that will give me an incredible reward. Obviously, the world to come is more reliable than the stock market or the retirement system. And so the idea being that if you bear the suffering with joy and gladness because of the coming reward, and you know that these were not deserved sufferings, then there is a benefit that is accruing to you. And we finished off with the concept that some of the suffering can be a source of positive self-growth. That was our analogy to suffering as salt, compared to the salt that went on the sacrifices of days past. All right, now today, excuse me. Speaking of monologues, so today we are going to resume the conversation that got started in the middle of this section of Talmud about whether or not everything that happens to us could be called Isurim Ahava, suffering of love. That are there some limits on what we can attach that label to? Again, self-attach the label to. This is not about telling your neighbor that. And we talked in the last session about things that interrupt our study or interrupt our prayer as being unlikely to be Isurim Ahava, because after all, these are some of the intrinsic ways of connecting to God, and causing us to be unable to do them seems to be above and beyond the normal measure of what we call suffering of love. Today, we're going to talk about other elements that could or couldn't be in this category, and it's going to get personal, and it's going to get exceedingly painful. So I just want to give that little warning here. Hopefully, when you tuned into a class on suffering, you knew not everything was going to be happy, but let me just warn you once again, some of the topics that will be discussed, from illness to loss of children, are going to be extremely painful, and the rabbi's responses are going to be varied. And that's just my little way to segue into a general Talmudic discussion, which is sometimes different voices within the tradition have different opinions. I know, it's a shocker. Multiple Jews have multiple interpretations. The Talmud does not speak with one voice, and we shouldn't believe that the last word was the final word. And that is something that can make the Talmud difficult to study for people that are just looking for a happy condensed version. But as I said in the very first session of this class, Judaism does not give us a happy condensed version to help us navigate suffering, because suffering is as difficult and deep as each individual's life can be, and thus cannot be reduced to a bumper sticker. All right, enough of me. Let's get back into the Talmud and see what it has to say to us today. So we are picking up here at the end of Brachot 5a. That is to say, the page in the Talmud is 5a. As always, highly recommend going to Sefaria or any other Talmud of your that you have access to, and you can study additionally on your own. You don't have to listen to only my commentary and analysis. Additionally, it was taught in a Breita. Little Talmud 101, a Breita is a piece of rabbinic text that predates the Talmudic period, that is from around the time of the rabbis of the Mishnah, what we call the Tanaim, but was not included in the Mishnah itself. The Mishnah was the stripped to the bone, cleanest explanation of what we call Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral law, but there were many other teachings that were going around at the same time, that didn't make the editorial cut to be in the Mishnah itself, but they still have standing and status, and they must be evaluated for the quality of what they are trying to teach us. So the Talmud is bringing one of those braitas. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai says, the Holy One, blessed be he, gave Israel 3 precious gifts, all of which were given only by means of suffering. These gifts are Torah, Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, and the world to come, what we call Olam Haba. All right, so that's the basic statement, and now we're going to get some proof texts. So what Shimon bar Yochai is saying is that, just like we said in the last paragraph about salt, that sometimes suffering comes with beneficial growth, sometimes things that are of utmost importance will have suffering along the path, that they are not acquired without that difficulty in its way. Does that mean they are worth it or not worth it? Well, that is something we can continue to ruminate on ourselves. But Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai is saying, look, these 3 biggies, they're not going to happen without suffering. Now, as is common for rabbinic literature, he's not expecting you to just accept that. He has proof texts that he believes support this claim, or indeed from which he derived this claim. From where is it derived that Torah is required by means of suffering? As it is said, happy is the man whom you afflict, Lord, and after which it is said, and teach from your Torah. That is to say, the full version of that verse, happy is the man whom you afflict, Lord, the man you teach from your Torah. Here we can see quite plainly affliction and teaching are going hand in hand. The acquisition of Torah is always going to come with challenges and difficulty. I know that there are other ideas out there that study will always be seamless and perfect and never have any cost associated with it or any challenges, but that is not the case. When we study, it is always going to be challenging, or else we're not doing it right. And when we study, we will often find that there are conflicts with other things. It will change our life sometimes in ways that are at least momentarily uncomfortable or create challenges and difficulties. And this is something that we should expect when we come to Torah, that we don't acquire it effortlessly, and we don't acquire it without disruption. The Torah is an incredibly disruptive book in the history of humanity. And the Torah isn't a disruptive book in the life of most of us because, well, our lives need disrupting. But that doesn't mean it's always pleasant when going through that disruption. Second point, Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, is given by suffering. How do we know that? It is written, as a man rebukes his son, so the Lord God rebukes you. This is from Deuteronomy 8, and it is written thereafter, for the Lord your God will bring you to a good land. So, because we have this juxtaposition of rebuke as exemplified in the mind of the rabbi through suffering and the acquisition of the land of Israel, then we can understand that Israel as well is not going to simply fall into our lap. There will be incredible challenges, difficulty, and pain involved in coming into that land, both in the days of Joshua and in every century since. And therefore, we should not be surprised that suffering will come alongside of that. And then the worlds to come, Olam Haba, the afterlife, as it is written, for the mitzvah is a lamp, the Torah is light, and the reproofs of instruction are the way of life. This is taken from Mishle, the book of Proverbs. That is to say, one may arrive at the lamp of mitzvah and the light of Torah that exist in the worlds to come only by means of reproofs of the instruction in this world, only through that type of rebuke and chastisement for when we are in error. So the rabbis understood and accepted that there are times when suffering comes as an instructional tool, and that sometimes that suffering and the instruction that it's giving us is absolutely worth it. That doesn't mean that every form of suffering is an instructional tool. One of the things that I said earlier in the sessions and in the classes, and I will repeat again, is what the rabbis entertain here are not one-size-fits-all answers. This is not about just saying, oh, I remember how we're supposed to interpret this, we're supposed to interpret it as suffering is always worth it. That's not the case. Some forms of suffering lead to some outcomes in which the suffering was an important instructional or necessary condition for passing through a threshold to achieve. That doesn't make every form of suffering okay. Remember our first rule: suffering is real and suffering isn't great. The fact that it happens sometimes with necessity is not a contradiction to that. It is an exception. And exceptions mean that they do not explain every form of suffering, and they do not relieve us of the burden of dealing with other types of suffering in different ways. Dealing them in different ways is going to be very important shortly. Well, shortly, depending upon how long I continue to talk. All right, so we're going to now get into more of those limitations on sufferings of love. We're sort of returning to the earlier topic that the last two paragraphs of this section of Talmud had been a digression from. And let's go ahead and see. This is beginning here on 5b, the second half of that page of Talmud. And you can see there's a whole lot to unpack here. Again, we have a Tana, one of the early ages of rabbis, and then we have the Breita, one of these non-Mishnaic texts from that time. A Tana taught the following Breita before Rabbi Yochanan: if one engages in Torah and acts of charity and buries his sons, all his transgressions are forgiven. All right, so now this Tana is acting as a living repository of these earlier traditions. This was, in fact, a job that many great sages had, and some people who weren't considered great sages but had great memories, which is to say, they had memorized many of the different teachings of the earlier generations. And you would ask them for a teaching on a topic, and they would recall, this is what was said. So Rabbi Yochanan is sitting, and the Tana is reciting what had been taught, and he is going to give his opinions. But let's make sure we understand the basic phrase, and then we'll see what his opinions are. If one engages in Torah and acts of charity. All right, so those we kind of understand. If you are studying and you do tzedakah, you are properly performing your duties in taking care of others, and you bury your sons. Now, that is a not so euphemistic expression, meaning that you have gone through the suffering of losing a child. That amount of suffering is considered to be an enormous burden for any person to have to shoulder, and as such, it is considered part and parcel of this atonement, because surely any other transgressions that you have committed have been erased. The punishment that was due for them have been erased by the overabundance of suffering that occurs when a person buries their child. Now, let's just make sure we understand the underlying calculation theology here. We talked about this before, but repetition is important. The rabbis seem to be implying, at least some of them, that God is, well, keeping score, that there is an account book, the giant spreadsheet in the sky. And in that spreadsheet are all of the things that we have done that were right, and those are deserving of reward. And so there's a blank for what reward was given to pay back that proper action. And all of the things we did wrong, our transgressions, are there as well, and there is a blank for what was done to punish that particular transgression. And while we understand that there is time for repentance, for teshuvah, for changing, for making amends, and all the other things that can be done to avoid punishment for our transgression by rectifying the cause, and also there is time for people, unfortunately, to regret their good deeds and to lose the reward that they might have been expected to get. In general, this is the basic tablet. Now, the rabbis understand that in addition to that basic, there are good deeds that deserve rewards and there are bad deeds that deserve punishment, that sometimes there are just rewards and punishments that are not actually tied to a deed. Now, that makes it not a reward or punishment, but simply good things and bad things that happen in life that are not immediately attached to one of the things that you have done, good or bad. As such, there is a credit or a debit on your account because you have received too much suffering for what you deserve, or you have received too much reward for what you deserve. And as such, those books will have to be balanced eventually. What the Tana seems to be saying here in this Breita is that sometimes, well, if you've lost lost a child, that we should not expect that to be equal to any misdeed you committed. That you're not being punished through the loss of your child, and that's balancing out your bad deed. Instead, this is one of those free-floating negative things, negative debts that will have to be balanced out. And the way it's being balanced out in this teaching is that the amount of suffering you went through in the loss of your child will be used to offset the suffering that you did deserve from other transgressions that you committed. So it is evening out those books because there was always going to be a surplus of suffering when it comes to the loss of a child, more than your other transgressions would have warranted. All right. As I said, the rabbis say few words, but they mean a lot. So that's the basic idea, that if you've done Torah, you've done tzedakah, and you've lost your children, everything's taken care of. Right? You have already paid for anything you might have done, and you have already earned enough reward just by studying Torah and doing tzedakah. You're good. The books are balanced. You're fine. Now, Rabbi Yochanan is going to challenge this. Rabbi Yochanan is a very important voice for this. I know sometimes, I should say often, I don't draw attention to who the different rabbis were during a discussion because sometimes that can simply sidetrack our conversation too much. But here we really need to know who Rabbi Yochanan is, and he is going to come back a few times over the next few paragraphs. Rabbi Yochanan was one of the great sages, and he is somebody very famous for having lost his children, many children. And as such, the idea that losing your sons is somehow wiping away your transgressions is going to be of particular interest to him. He is going to really drill down on this topic because, well, he is personally involved in a way that few other people are involved, given how many of his children he had to bury. So let's see what his line of discussion is on this. Rabbi Yochanan said to him, to the person reciting this Breita, what is your source for this? Right? What proof do you have for this? Granted, if one engages in Torah and acts of charity, his transgressions are forgiven. As it is written, with mercy and truth, iniquity is expiated. And mercy refers to acts of tzedakah, of charity, as it is stated, also in Proverbs, he who pursues charity and mercy finds life, charity, and honor. And mercy and charity are listed there together. And truth refers to Torah, as it is stated from a different part of Proverbs, buy truth and do not sell it, also wisdom, guidance, and understanding. So there it's very clear that that's connected to Torah. So the idea that these acts, the pursuit of Torah and the giving of tzedakah, that these create expiation, that these create life for us when we were faced with a debt for our misdeeds, that seems to be perfectly reasonable. He can immediately come up with verses that can justify that explanation, that these will offset transgressions. However, from where is it derived that the transgressions of one who buries his sons are also forgiven? This is going to be his point of investigation, is probably the best way to put it. So Rabbi Yochanan starts off by asking, prove that those three things can create forgiveness. And he answers the first two by himself, meaning you don't have to explain Torah and tzedakah. Those I can work out, but the burial of your children, I'm going to need a little proof on that. Can we get some assistance on that? And then we're going to give an attempt. An answer was provided to Rabbi Yochanan when a certain elder taught him in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So another person says, well, I do have a teaching that is on this topic that will provide an answer. Now, I very carefully said provide an answer because it doesn't mean it is the answer. Very often these sections of Talmud are edited. It often will appear as though all the rabbis are in one giant room talking, but it can often be that one rabbi is talking in their own time or their own place, and then their text is being juxtaposed to the teaching of the previous text. And those two rabbis may never have met in their life, but their teachings are being put next to each other to create a more cohesive understanding. That's okay. That's perfectly fine. There's nothing deceitful about this. This is how we recognize the open and incredibly broad conversational platform of our people that has continued for 3,000 years. So what does this teaching from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, but not actually said by him to Rabbi Yochanan, but by some other elder who was remembering this teaching say? This conclusion about when you bury your children, sins are forgiven, is derived by a verbal analogy between the words iniquity and iniquity. This is what's called a gezerah shava. It's a technical hermeneutical word. And I'm sorry for the fancy language, but what it means is that there are certain styles of derivation, of analysis of the text that are considered to be important and powerful when trying to understand difficult passages or ideas. And one of them, this gezerah shava, means that if you see the same word used in two different places, then those words can share an important meaning that may be obvious in one place, but was not obvious in the next. So let's see if we can't unpack how that works here, and maybe that'll make it easier to understand this technique. Here it is written, and by here they're talking back about this idea of with mercy and truth, iniquity is expiated from Proverbs 16. And with mercy and truth, iniquity is expiated. That's our key word, iniquity. And there, meaning Jeremiah, it is written, he repays the iniquity of the fathers onto the bosom of their children. Okay, so we have iniquity, mercy, truth, iniquity. And in Jeremiah, repays iniquity. Iniquity appears in both. In the second text, it sounds like, or at least is potentially interpreted to mean that the transgressions that I commit could be paid for through my children. And that means that when we say with mercy and truth, iniquity is expiated, when you read iniquity, you should also be reading in parentheses through your children. That is to say, iniquity is expiated through the children. So that is the attempt. Because he repays the iniquity of the father onto the bosom of the children, their father's transgressions are forgiven. Rabbi Yochanan said, leprosy and suffering due to children are not afflictions of love. All right, interesting rhetorical technique that he is taking here. Rabbi Yochanan is not saying it's wrong, and he's not saying it's right, but he is saying something parallel but different. So that idea that when the children die, it's covering over my sins is something that will have to be discussed in much more detail later. At the moment, Rabbi Yochanan is essentially saying, let's table that for a moment. We'll come back to that conversation of the sins of the fathers being paid for through the death of the children. We're going to come back to that. And Rabbi Yochanan, like I said, has a personal stake in that idea because he has buried so many children. It would imply that he was exceedingly sinful, which is not a great implication. So instead, he wants to talk about a parallel topic that you might be wrongly considering. Leprosy and suffering due to children are not afflictions of love. Remember that topic of Isirim Ahava, the suffering of love. It's been floating around for the last page of Talmud and, well, last week and a half now of our class. And Rabbi Yochanan wants to make sure that this is added to the list of exceptions of things that could not, even internally, be decided were classified as Isuri Mahava, as afflictions of love. So what he is saying here is, look, if you get leprosy, which is technically called sara'at, and we'll talk about that in the next paragraph in more detail, or you bury your children, you are not allowed to call these Isuri Mahava, right? This is straight up suffering, and not necessarily something that should be given this other title. Now, that's going to be challenged by the Talmud, because, well, he's one opinion, and there are other opinions that need to wrestle with this. So let's deal with the issue of sara'at first. Sara'at is the proper Hebrew term for what is usually called leprosy, but it is a condition which bears some superficial resemblance to leprosy in its description, but is not considered to actually be the technical modern identified condition of leprosy. Sara'at was a spiritual illness that was manifest through physical symptoms. It does not mean that anybody in the modern world is suffering from sara'at. They are suffering from leprosy or Hansen's disease, and thankfully there are numerous ways to treat that now and to prevent it from having the same horrible effect on someone's life. Now, the Gemara wants to talk about this topic. We're just going to use the word leprosy because that's what the translation uses. But please keep in the back of your mind, this isn't what the AMA calls leprosy. Is leprosy not an affliction of love? Are you sure about that, Rabbi Yochanan? Didn't we learn in a Braita, another text, if one has any of the 4 signs of leprosy, sure, enumerated in Leviticus 13, they are nothing other than an altar of atonement. All right, I mean, look, these are atoning, so doesn't that make them Isuri Mahava? Now, hopefully you can already begin to see that being a source of atonement does not immediately make it Isuri Mahava, that these are not synonymous conditions. That something can be an affliction of love without being a direct atonement for a misdeed. Indeed, that's how we began this whole section, by saying there are some afflictions which come with no transgression as their cause, and there are things that can atone, which are not Isuri Mahava. And indeed, that's how the Gemara is going to answer its own question. Although the signs of leprosy are an altar of atonement for one's transgressions, they are not an affliction of love. Meaning, yes, through the process of going through sara'at, a person can atone for whatever misdeed had generated this spiritual affliction. But we should not put them in the category of Isuri Mahava, of afflictions of love. However, the Talmud does open up an alternative. And if you wish, say, this is another Talmudic flourish, where it's going to bring a second opinion, which presents an alternative analysis of the question at hand. In this case, it's the statement by Rabbi Yochanan that leprosy is not an Isuri Mahava, not an affliction of love. So we could answer that question by saying, yes, leprosy is an altar of atonement, but no, it's not Isuri Mahava. 2 technical terms mean different things. Calling it an altar of atonement does not give it affliction of love status. However, we could read it differently. This Braita, which says that leprosy is an affliction of love, is for us in Babylonia. Right? This is Babylon, not in the ancient world. This is Babylon in the early centuries of the Common Era, but then under Persian, eventually Muslim rule. It's a complicated part of the world, but we still called it Bavel because that's what it was called when we first got dragged there during the destruction of the first temple. So for those of us in Babylonia, this is an affliction of love, because outside of Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, we are not as careful in the laws of ritual impurity, and one afflicted with leprosy may interact with others, mitigating his suffering. And that statement of Rabbi Yochanan, that leprosy is not an affliction of love, is for them in Eretz Israel, where they are exceedingly careful of the laws of ritual impurity, and the suffering of a leper is great because he is banished from society. So the second interpretation of why the one verse that says they are afflictions of love and Rabbi Yochanan says they're not is because Rabbi Yochanan lived in the land of Israel, and there the social norms of concern over ritual purity meant that somebody with Sarat would have an exceedingly difficult life because of the way the society was structured. Whereas somebody who lived in Babel, where those issues were not treated with as much zeal, would not be suffering as much. And as such, we can see that they were each right within their own geographical area. Again, this is very similar to our discussion about whether an affliction that drives you from prayer or prevents you from study would be considered ahava, that the worse the affliction is, the less we are inclined to call it a form of suffering from love, that there is something much worse going on here. And if you wish, third version of an interpretation, which, as you can probably gather, usually means there is a lot of disagreement about how best to understand this. Instead, this Braita, which says that leprosy is an affliction of love, refers to concealed leprosy. That only strikes the concealed areas of one body. But that statement of Rabbi Yochanan refers to visible leprosy that causes those who see it to distance themselves from the leper. So again, it's much worse if everybody sees it, and that would not be a suffering from love. And it's not so bad if no one else sees it, which would mean it could be technically a suffering of love. All right. Now, one thing in our Talmud 101 sidebar, I want to draw your attention to is the few number of bold words in this paragraph. Remember, in this translation, the bold words are the words that are a more literal translation of the Talmud, and the not bolded words, the regular strength font, are the commentary or language that's used to stitch them together into a more natural structure for a modern English reader. Well, there's a whole knot. And if you say, this is for us, and that is for them, that would have been one sentence in the Talmud, and everything else in that chunk was not on the page. And you have to understand what they mean by is for us and for them, meaning that us means Babylon, and us in Babylon is not such a problem, and them means Israel, and for them it is. And likewise, and if you wish, say, this is concealed and that is visible, you have to apply or have to provide all the additional interpretation. The Talmud was not written to explain itself. It was there to help you remember the explanations, which is what our translation has helpfully put in on the page for us, with occasional assistance from me, but mostly it's the Davidson translation. But the Talmud itself is very, very precise. It is the bullet points on the PowerPoint presentation. It is not a full explanation that you're supposed to get from your teacher, which is, hey, what we're doing now. All right. Now, we talked about the leprosy issue, about whether or not that counts as Isuri Mahava. And we got 3 different varieties. Oh, see, I almost forgot to explain that as well. And those 3 different varieties of explanation, one, that it's a technical term difference, 2, that it is about which country you're living in, or 3, whether it's concealed or visible, you might be asking, well, which is it? Well, we don't get a resolution that it is one or the other, and it can be all 3. And indeed, we learn something meaningful from all 3 of those explanations. From the first, that this is a technical differentiation, we learned that not every form of atonement is a suffering of love, and not every form of suffering of love is connected to atonement, that there are 2 different categories, and we need to keep them separate when we are thinking about this for ourselves and our own life. The second one is reminding us that the difficulty of something is relative. It can be relative to where you are or when you live. It can be relative based upon the cultural norms that you happen to be under. And that matters, that there isn't always an objective definition of this is always an affliction of love, or this is never an affliction of love, that sometimes it will feel one way or the other, depending upon other circumstances that are beyond our control. And that, of course, applies as well for the second, where sometimes the things that we do that are concealed, we can live with, and we can find a way to manage and handle without it being a too great of suffering, and other things which are revealed, even if they are not so great in and of themselves, nevertheless will cause us great suffering because of how it's perceived by others. And that perception of others becomes very important in how we understand what suffering feels like from that first person point of view. That this is meant to remind us of what that's like to actually go through, rather than think about this purely in a sterile technical terms. All right. But of course, Rabbi Yochanan was mostly interested. I don't want to put words into his mouth, but because of his personal circumstances, he was mostly interested with regards to the loss of children. And therefore, the Gemara will come back to that topic and try and give us more information. And suffering due to children is not an affliction of love, because that's what Rabbi Yochanan said. The Gemara clarifies. What are the circumstances? Meaning, okay, well, maybe there is a type of suffering from children that is a suffering of love, and maybe there is a type of suffering from children that isn't a suffering of love. What are those circumstances? Well, if you say that he had children and they died, meaning that those are the circumstances, you had kids, the kids died, and yet I'm still trying to claim this is the suffering of love. Didn't Rabbi Yochanan himself say, while consoling the victim of a catastrophe, this is the bone of my 10th son? Meaning, Rabbi Yochanan experienced the death of 10 of his children, and he kept a small bone from his 10th child as a painful memorial. He would show that bone to others in order to console them. And since he showed it to them, the deaths of his children must certainly have been afflictions of love. He consoled others by displaying that there is an element of intimacy with God that exists in that suffering. This is based off the teaching of the Tosafot, one of the great collection of medieval commentary. Why then would Rabbi Yochanan have said that suffering due to children is not afflictions of love? Rather, meaning it wouldn't make sense, and we'll unpack this as a block once we get to the end. One must conclude that when Rabbi Yochanan said that those afflictions are not afflictions of love, he was speaking with regard to one who has no children. And when one had children who died, this could very well be considered afflictions of love. All right, we got to untangle this because it's going to seem very counterintuitive, if not already. So Rabbi Yochanan, basic detail, he lost 10 children, and indeed he kept a tiny fragment of bone below the minimum measure from which it would be a problem halakhically, as a symbol that he would show to people when he was trying to console them. That is to say, if somebody else had lost a child, he would come to them and he would show them that bone and basically be saying, I do know what you think, what you are feeling. Most people, when they say that to somebody who is grieving, especially the loss of a child, don't know what they're talking about. And it's a terrible thing to try and use as an explanation. But Rabbi Yochanan really did understand, having lost 10 of his children, which was an extraordinary amount, even in the days of high infant mortality of the ancient world. He did know what that grief felt like, and he is not diminishing it or belittling those who are grieving. He is saying, I am with you. I know better than anyone what this is like, and we are in this together. And understand that this situation is something that can draw you closer to God rather than to push you further away from God. We're going to come back to the whole idea of how does suffering draw me closer, and do I really want it to? Maybe we'll start it today. We'll see. I'll make that judgment in just a second. But that seems to be what he is talking here. Now, if he is saying that, then the Talmud is saying, if it's not, if it is possible to interpret the death of a child by someone like Rabbi Yochanan, who lost 10, as being circumstances of love. And indeed, he even had a whole object lesson that he would use when consoling other people. Then what did he mean when the suffering that comes from children is not a suffering of ahava, suffering of love? Because what are the type of suffering of children are there? Well, here's the very counterintuitive part, at least for the modern world, for many people, at least publicly. He is saying it is the suffering that comes with regards to children when you have no children, that it is the struggle of infertility, that it is the struggle of being unable to conceive, that pain is one that is not possible to be called a suffering of love, that there is a form of suffering that comes through the yearning to have a child and being unable to, that it would be irresponsible to call a suffering of love. And indeed, we know throughout the Torah and Tanakh, infertility has been one of the most unconsolable of situations for people in so many different stories. Only last week in our Torah portion of Vayetze, we see Rachel being very unconsolable when she is begging for Jacob to help her to have a child. And we saw similar things with Rebecca and, of course, with Sarah. This is one of the most poignant things that a person can go through. And as such, Rabbi Yochanan is essentially, through this interpretation of the Gemara, saying that is a type of suffering that we cannot call a suffering from love. That we could potentially, and that potentially is going to have to stay for a while, we could potentially call the death of a child a suffering of love, but we can't call the absence of a child a suffering of love. Now, I think we're going to have to put it off, as much as I hate this, because we're going to need to do a run on the next few paragraphs, so they're not going to make sense. And we've only got 12 minutes left for my usual force myself to stop at 1 hour mark. And I don't think we're going to be able to get enough done. That wouldn't make it even more confusing than what we've already got. Now, let's just do a little debrief here, because I don't want you walking away thinking that Rabbi Yochanan is okay with the death of his children. He is not. And he's not saying that anyone should be okay with the death of their children. What he is trying to say is that the death of a child should not be seen as the ultimate punishment that God has given you, that your transgressions have led to the death of the children, and you are a terrible person, and that's why your children died. All of those horrible thoughts that a person might have, Rabbi Yochanan is saying, no, that's not the way we interpret this. It's better to interpret it as Isuri Mahava, that the amount of suffering that you go through from the loss of a child will be added to that account book, and you will be rewarded for that. We want our children back, and we mourn their loss, and it is painful to the utmost degree, but we should not see it as being punishment. And we should understand that anyone who suffers this much will be blessed with reward in the world to come for the amount of unanswerable suffering that they have had to endure. Now, is that enough consolation to a person who has gone through it? Well, if I said this to somebody in the midst of their grieving for the loss of a child, almost certainly not. Telling them the amount of suffering you have now is going to yield eventual blessings to you is not going to work, because thank God I've never had that personal experience. And indeed, within my immediate family, we haven't had that personal experience. But if Rabbi Yochanan says it, well, he sits there and shows you the physical bone of one of his children, that could work. That might be some form of consolation to a victim of a type of disaster similar to that. I don't know. And what the Talmud is giving us a glimpse at here, and that we're going to examine in much more detail next class, is the theory around suffering is not always going to give us a one-to-one explanation of our bedside manner. That sometimes we'll have the idea of, okay, well, maybe this is this, or maybe that is this, or this suffering means reward, or that we might have that as an almost academic understanding, or even a deeply spiritual understanding. But that doesn't mean we're always going to do the right thing when we are sitting with a person who is going through acute grief. That is the reality of life, is that while a person is grieving most acutely, all of the theology and all of the analysis and all of the wisdom of our tradition can sometimes not penetrate through that pain. And that's okay. We're not expected to, and we're not expecting them to hear it. Again, going back to that story of Job, one of the worst things that his so-called friends did was show up and try to explain to him why it was all his fault. And they thought this was going to make it better because at least he'd understand. Obviously, that didn't work. Obviously, it also wasn't his fault. But even if it had been his fault, it would have been a pretty ineffective technique for dealing with somebody else's grief. And so what we're seeing here is that there is a hint of you have to be the right person to say certain things to some people in these circumstances. And even then, it's a little bit of a judgment call of whether or not that's going to bring consolation, do nothing, or perhaps even make them feel worse. And for that kind of case study bedside manner, we're going to look at that next time. As always, you can look up this section of the Talmud and read ahead if you like. But we're going to be getting into some more of the practical side of helping a person who is suffering. And then once we finish that section, we're going to continue back in this part of the Talmud, talking about the underlying theological problems of why does God do this in the first place in the broadest sense? And once we finish that, well, then we'll be moving on to different techniques our tradition have suggested for trying to understand suffering and trying to cope with suffering. But that'll be a few weeks down the line because there's a lot more to say before we get there. All right, everybody, thank you so much for studying with me. And I look forward to seeing you all, well, in person, hopefully, but also next week with our class here online. Take care and be